People always imagine hospitals are peaceful after midnight. The truth is, they're anything but. Machines never stop beeping, nurses never stop moving, and someone is always awake. Still, there are moments during the night when the hallways become so quiet that every footstep echoes through the building. That's exactly what happened during my first month working overnight security at St. Matthew's Medical Center, and it's the reason I refuse to work another night shift in a hospital. I started the job in the fall of 2021. My shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. Most nights were incredibly routine. I'd patrol different floors, make sure restricted doors were locked, help lost visitors find their way, and occasionally escort disruptive people out of the emergency department. It wasn't exciting, but it paid the bills. I figured the biggest challenge would be staying awake until sunrise. About 4 weeks into the job, I was assigned to check the 6th floor every night around 2:30. It was one of the quietest wings in the hospital, mostly filled with patients recovering from surgery. By that time of night, visiting hours were long over, the lights were dimmed, and the hallways felt almost abandoned. One Tuesday night, as I walked past room 614, I noticed the call light flashing above the door. That wasn't unusual by itself. Patients pressed the call button all the time. A nurse walked into the room while I continued my patrol. Only a few seconds later, she stepped back into the hallway with a puzzled expression on her face. I asked if everything was okay. She looked back at the room before quietly saying, "I could have sworn someone pressed the call button." I glanced inside. The room was completely empty. The bed was neatly made, the lights were off, and there wasn't a single piece of equipment connected to anything. Confused, I asked where the patient was. She frowned and replied, "There hasn't been anyone in that room for 3 days." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The call light suddenly stopped flashing on its own. The nurse shrugged, assuming it was some kind of electrical problem, and continued down the hallway. I did the same, convincing myself there had to be a simple explanation. Hospitals are old buildings. Strange electrical issues happen all the time. The following night, I returned to the 6th floor at almost the exact same time. As soon as I turned the corner, my stomach sank. The call light above room 614 was flashing again. This time, I was alone. I walked slowly toward the room and looked through the doorway. It was still empty. I stepped inside anyway, expecting to find some maintenance issue with the call button. The room looked exactly as it had the night before. The television was off. The blinds were closed. The heart monitor beside the bed wasn't even plugged in. I checked the bathroom. Nobody. As I turned to leave, I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me." It wasn't loud. It sounded weak, almost like someone who had been sick for a very long time. Every muscle in my body tightened. I slowly turned around. The room was empty. Before I could even process what had happened, my radio crackled with a routine status check. I answered as calmly as I could, but my eyes never left that empty hospital bed. I walked out of the room much faster than I had entered it. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to another security officer who had worked there for years. I expected him to laugh. Instead, he looked at me for a second before asking, "Was it room 614? When I nodded, he sighed. I figured it would happen eventually. His response bothered me all day. That evening, I decided to ask one of the senior nurses about the room. The moment I mentioned the number, her smile disappeared. She hesitated before telling me about a teenage girl who had spent nearly 8 months in that room while waiting for a heart transplant. According to her, the staff had grown incredibly close to the girl because she rarely had visitors. Nurses would sit with her during breaks just so she wouldn't feel alone. Unfortunately, the transplant never came. She passed away just a few days before Christmas. The nurse lowered her voice before saying something I'll never forget. "Every now and then, that call light still comes on." I tried to smile, but it didn't feel convincing. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts. I told myself there had to be faulty wiring somewhere behind the walls. After all, hospitals are full of complicated electrical systems. Then Friday night arrived. At exactly 2:33 in the morning, I turned the corner and immediately noticed someone standing inside room 614. A young girl. She was wearing a hospital gown and her back was facing me. For a brief moment, I assumed someone had finally been admitted to the room. I stepped inside and politely asked if she needed help. She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed toward the window. I turned my head. The blinds were completely closed. There was nothing to see except my own reflection faintly visible in the glass. When I looked back, she was gone. I searched the bathroom, I checked behind the curtain, I even looked underneath the bed, even though I knew how ridiculous that was. There was nobody. Just then, my radio came alive again, calling me to the intensive care unit. I hurried downstairs, trying my best to forget what had just happened. The ICU was unusually chaotic that night. Doctors rushed between rooms while alarms echoed down the hallway. By the time things settled down, nearly an hour had passed. One of the nurses looked at me and casually asked if I had been on the 6th floor earlier. When I told her yes, she looked uncomfortable. Then she quietly said, "Every time that call light comes on, someone dies before sunrise." I wanted to dismiss it as superstition. Coincidence. Nothing more. Then I read the overnight report before going home. At 4:12 a.m., a patient in the ICU had unexpectedly gone into cardiac arrest. Despite every effort to save him, he didn't survive. After that night, I avoided room 614 whenever I could. If the call light started flashing, I found another hallway to patrol. I didn't care if anyone thought I was being lazy. There were plenty of other floors that needed checking. A month later, I accepted another security job and turned in my resignation. On my final night, I decided to walk through the 6th floor one last time. Part of me wanted to prove I'd simply let a few ghost stories get into my head. Everything looked perfectly normal. The hallway was empty. The lights were dim. The air felt still. Then the call light above room 614 flickered on. I stared at it for several seconds. Before I could take another step, an elderly doctor walked into the hallway. He noticed the light, calmly reached over to the nurse's station and switched it off. He looked at me and quietly said, "You should head home." I asked him if someone had finally been admitted to the room. He looked genuinely confused. Then he smiled sadly. "There hasn't been a patient in that room for almost 9 years." I didn't ask another question. I walked out of the hospital before sunrise and never returned. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online to see if the hospital had renovated the 6th floor. Instead, I found a local news article announcing a major expansion project. The article included a photograph of workers removing room numbers from the hallway. Every room still had a number. Every room, except one. Where room 614 should have been, there was only a smooth, freshly painted wall. It looked as though that room had never existed at all.
I never believed hospitals were haunted. I had heard the stories, of course. Every hospital has them. Nurses talk about empty wheelchairs moving on their own, patients claiming they saw someone standing in their room, or strange noises echoing through empty hallways. I always assumed those stories came from exhaustion. After all, when you spend 12 hours working through the night, your mind starts playing tricks on you. At least, that's what I believed, until my 3rd month working as a patient care technician at Westbrook Medical Center. I worked the overnight shift from 7 p.m. until 7 a.m. Most nights followed the same routine. We'd help patients settle in, take vital signs every few hours, answer call lights, and make sure everyone was comfortable before sunrise. By 2 or 3 in the morning, the hospital became incredibly quiet. Visitors were gone, the hallways emptied, and the only sounds left were heart monitors beeping and the occasional squeak of a nurse's shoes against the polished floor. One Friday night, I was assigned to Ward C, one of the oldest sections of the hospital. Most of the rooms were occupied by elderly patients recovering from surgery. Around 2:45 in the morning, I was finishing paperwork at the nurse's station when I heard a call light chime. I looked up at the monitor expecting to see a room number flash on the screen, but nothing appeared. A few seconds later, the chime sounded again. One of the nurses looked up from the desk and frowned. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I nodded, as she checked the monitor, but nothing appeared on the screen. There wasn't a single active call light anywhere on the floor. She looked just as confused as I was, before quietly saying, "No one's calling." We both shrugged and went back to our work, assuming it was some kind of technical glitch. About 5 minutes later, the same chime echoed through the hallway again. This time it sounded louder, almost impatient. I decided to walk the corridor and check every room myself. Every patient was asleep, every door was closed, and not a single call light was illuminated. Everything appeared completely normal, until I reached the far end of the hallway. That's when I noticed an empty wheelchair facing the wall. I stopped immediately, because I was certain it hadn't been there a few minutes earlier. Trying not to let my imagination get the better of me, I slowly walked toward it. The closer I got, the colder the hallway became. It wasn't the normal chill from the hospital's air conditioning. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could actually see my breath. I looked around for an open window or an air vent, but there was nothing that could explain it. Finally, I reached for the wheelchair, intending to roll it back to storage. The instant my hands touched the handles, the call light chime rang again. This time it sounded as if it had come from directly behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance, but the hallway was completely empty. When I turned back toward the wheelchair, something felt wrong. It suddenly seemed much heavier than before, almost as if someone invisible was sitting in it. My heart started racing. I let go of the handles immediately and backed away, before quickly returning to the nurse's station. When I told the charge nurse what had happened, she listened without interrupting me. After I finished, she looked at me for a few seconds before asking one simple question. "Was the wheelchair facing the wall?" I stared at her in disbelief. "How did you know?" She lowered her eyes to the paperwork on her desk and quietly replied, "You're not the first person who's mentioned it." That answer sent a chill through me because she said it as though it was something she'd accepted years ago. Around 4 in the morning, another call came in from room 327. An elderly woman recovering from hip surgery was visibly shaken when we entered. She pointed toward the doorway with trembling hands and whispered that a man had been standing there watching her. One of the nurses gently tried to reassure her, suggesting it was probably another staff member checking on patients, but she immediately shook her head. She insisted the man never enter the room. He simply stood in the doorway wearing a long white doctor's coat, silently staring at her before disappearing. After calming her down, we stepped back into the hallway. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Room 327 was directly across from where the wheelchair had been sitting only minutes earlier. Now it was gone. Neither of us had moved it. Housekeeping hadn't been through the hallway, and every storage room nearby was still locked. We searched the corridor from one end to the other, but there wasn't a single wheelchair anywhere. For the rest of the shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to find someone standing there. Every reflection in the class made me stop and look twice. I kept telling myself that I was exhausted and letting a few strange coincidences get inside my head, but the feeling never went away. Not long afterward, my radio crackled to life. A nurse asked if someone could check room 331 because an emergency call had just come through. I hurried down the hallway and found the door already open. The room was empty. The patient had been discharged hours earlier, and the bed had already been made for the next admission. I checked the bathroom just to be sure, but nobody was inside. As I turned to leave, I heard a soft cough directly behind me. I spun around instantly. The room was completely silent. A few minutes later, one of the senior nurses noticed the look on my face and quietly asked me to follow her. Without saying a word, she led me to an old framed photograph hanging outside the staff lounge. It showed doctors and nurses standing together when the hospital first opened in the 1960s. She pointed to one of the doctors standing in the center of the picture. He was wearing a long white coat. The moment I saw his face, I understood why the patient had been so frightened. He matched her description perfectly. The nurse explained that his name was Dr. Harold Bennett, a respected physician who had worked on Ward C for nearly 30 years before suffering a fatal heart attack during one of his overnight rounds. Since then, patients had occasionally reported seeing a doctor silently standing in their doorway during the early hours of the morning. He never entered the room, never spoke, and never acknowledged anyone. He simply watched before disappearing. Most employees dismissed the stories, but there were enough reports over the years that many experienced nurses quietly avoided working overnight on Ward C whenever they could. Before I had a chance to ask anything else, a code blue echoed through the hospital speakers. It was room 327. Everyone rushed back to the room where the elderly woman had been recovering. Despite the medical team's desperate efforts, she passed away just before sunrise. No one mentioned what she had told us earlier that night, and no one brought up the missing wheelchair again. It was as if those conversations had never happened. A few weeks later, I transferred to another department and never worked another overnight shift on Ward C.
Even now, whenever I visit the hospital for routine appointments, I find myself looking toward the end of that hallway. Most days it's bright, busy, and filled with nurses, patients, and visitors. But every single time, I catch myself checking one specific corner, hoping I won't see an empty wheelchair quietly facing the wall, waiting for someone else to notice it.
I've never been afraid of hospitals. Like most people, I associated them with doctors, nurses, and people trying to get better. That changed after I spent one weekend visiting my grandfather. Even now, years later, I still avoid walking through a hospital after dark. My grandfather had undergone heart surgery and was recovering in one of the older wings of Mercy General Hospital. The operation had gone well, but because of his age, the doctors wanted to keep him for a few extra days. I visited him every evening after work. On the third night, I arrived a little later than usual. Visiting hours had technically ended, but the nurse recognized me and quietly said I could stay for another 15 minutes before they locked the floor for the night. When I entered his room, he looked unusually restless. He wasn't in pain, but he kept glancing toward the hallway every few seconds. I asked if everything was okay. He hesitated before forcing a smile and telling me he just hadn't been sleeping well. I could tell he wasn't telling me the whole truth, but I didn't want to push him. Instead, we talked about family, watched part of a baseball game on television, and laughed about how terrible the hospital food was. A little after 10 o'clock, I stood up to leave. My grandfather suddenly grabbed my wrist much harder than I expected. His smile disappeared, and he looked directly into my eyes. In a quiet voice, he said, "When you leave, don't look down the hallway." I laughed, assuming he was joking, but he didn't laugh back. He repeated himself one more time. "I'm serious. Just walk to the elevator and don't look." His expression stayed with me as I stepped into the hallway. It was almost completely empty. Most of the lights had been dimmed for the night, and the only sounds were distant monitors beeping somewhere far down the corridor. I told myself my grandfather was probably just confused from the medication. Even so, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. I started walking toward the elevators, keeping my eyes straight ahead. For a while, everything seemed perfectly normal. Then I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Slow. Steady. They weren't loud, but they echoed through the hallway in a way that made it impossible to ignore them. At first, I assumed it was a nurse making her rounds. I kept walking, expecting whoever it was to pass me. Instead, the footsteps stayed the same distance behind me. I slowed down. So did they. I walked faster. The footsteps matched my pace perfectly. By then, my heart was beating much faster than it should have been. Every instant told me to turn around, but my grandfather's warning echoed in my mind. Don't look down the hallway. I reached the elevator and immediately pressed the button. The old elevator took forever to arrive. The footsteps continued getting closer, slow and deliberate, never speeding up, never stopping. I stared at the elevator display above the door as the numbers slowly changed. 6, 5, 4. The footsteps stopped. The sudden silence felt even worse. The elevator doors finally opened. I stepped inside and quickly pressed the lobby button. Just before the doors closed, curiosity got the better of me. I looked out into the hallway. There was no one there. Not a nurse. Not a patient. Nothing. I let out a nervous laugh, almost embarrassed by how badly I'd frightened myself. Once the elevator reached the lobby, I walked through the main entrance, got into my car, and drove home. The entire way, I kept telling myself that I had simply let my imagination get the better of me. Hospitals have a strange atmosphere at night, and after spending hours in those dimly lit hallways, it was easy to convince yourself you'd seen something that wasn't really there. The following evening, I returned to visit my grandfather. As soon as I walked into his room, he looked up from his bed and asked a question that immediately caught me off guard. "Did you look?" I hesitated for a moment before admitting that I had glanced down the hallway before leaving. He slowly closed his eyes and let out a quiet sigh. "I was hoping you hadn't," he said. Before I could ask what he meant, a nurse entered the room to check his medication.
We waited in silence until she finished and quietly left. Once the door closed, my grandfather leaned closer and lowered his voice. "The man at the end of the hallway, he's looking for someone to notice him." I forced a small smile, convinced the medication was causing him to imagine things. "What man?" I asked. Without taking his eyes off me, he answered, "The one standing outside every night." Instinctively, I glanced toward the hallway, but it was completely empty. My grandfather noticed what I had done and shook his head. "Not now," he whispered. "He only comes after midnight." I didn't know how to respond, so I changed the subject and spent the rest of the visit talking about home, family, and the day he would finally be discharged. About 30 minutes later, I left his room again. It was just before midnight, and the hallway felt even quieter than it had the night before. The lights had been dimmed, the nurse's station was nearly empty, and the only sound came from distant heart monitors somewhere farther down the corridor. I reached the elevator and pressed the call button. As I waited, I glanced at the polished metal doors in front of me. That's when my heart nearly stopped. Reflected in the metal was the unmistakable outline of someone standing directly behind me. I spun around instantly. The hallway was empty.
There wasn't a single person anywhere in sight. My pulse raced as I slowly turned back toward the elevator doors. The reflection had disappeared completely, as though it had never been there in the first place. I stood frozen until the elevator arrived, then stepped inside without looking back. The next morning, I convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Reflections can be deceptive, especially under dim lighting, and I told myself that exhaustion had probably caused my mind to play tricks on me. Over the following days, my grandfather recovered well enough to be discharged, and before long, life returned to normal. Eventually, I stopped thinking about the strange warning he'd given me. Nearly 6 months passed before the memory returned. I was having lunch with a close friend who worked as a nurse at Mercy General Hospital. During our conversation, I casually mentioned my grandfather's stay and laughed about the strange things he'd said near the end of my visits. Instead of laughing with me, my friend became unusually quiet. After a moment, she asked which floor my grandfather had been staying on. The instant I told her, the expression on her face changed. She quietly explained that patients on that floor had been describing the same mysterious man for years. They all claimed to see a tall figure standing silently at the far end of the hallway shortly after midnight. He never walked toward anyone, never spoke, and never entered a room. He simply stood there, watching. What unsettled the staff wasn't just that people claimed to see him, it was that every description matched perfectly. A tall man dressed in a dark suit, standing with his hands folded in front of him, completely expressionless. I asked whether anyone had ever discovered who he was. She slowly shook her head before answering, "No one knows." Then, after a brief pause, she quietly added something I'll never forget. "The only patients who ever report seeing him are the ones who pass away within the next few days." For several seconds, I couldn't think of a single thing to say. I simply stared at her across the table. Eventually, she gave a nervous laugh and admitted that hospitals are full of stories, especially among employees who work overnight. She said she didn't know whether any of them were actually true. Still, as I drove home that evening, I couldn't stop hearing my grandfather's warning repeating in my mind. Don't look down the hallway. A few weeks later, while scrolling through old photos on my phone, I came across a picture I had taken outside my grandfather's room. It wasn't anything special, just a quick snapshot of the hallway so I could remember which room he'd been staying in. At first glance, everything looked completely normal. The hallway was empty, the lights were dim, and every patient door was closed. But when I zoomed in toward the far end of the corridor, my stomach dropped. Standing under the glowing emergency exit sign was a dark figure, completely motionless, watching straight down the hallway.
I don't remember seeing anyone when I took that picture. And even now, I've never had the courage to zoom in on it again.